Welcome back to another special episode of Beat Check with the Oregonian, where we look back at the case of Kyron Horman, the 7-year-old boy who disappeared from Portland's Skyline Elementary School in June 2010. I'm Julie Abenson, engagement editor here at the Oregonian. I'm here with social media producer Destiny Johnson. Today we're joined by City Hall reporter Shane Dixon Kavanaugh, who was a news intern when the news broke. So we are with Shane Dixon Kavanaugh, City Hall reporter here at the Oregonian, who was a news intern when this story broke back in 2010. So welcome, Shane. What was it like being an intern at that time?
When you talk about me being an intern in 2010, I always just want to remind folks that I kind of got a late start to journalism. So I was like a, say, 28, maybe 29-year-old intern. So for whatever that's worth.
Terms of like approaching the coverage, because if I had approached a story like Kyron Horman's disappearance as a 22-year-old intern, 21-year-old intern, I wouldn't have been able to, I don't think, understand the scope. Do you think that even though you're just an intern, that maybe a little bit of experience in the world helped you understand the scope of what exactly this meant?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps. I certainly spent a good number of years after college just sort of goofing around before deciding what I wanted to do with my life, and had this really just wonderful opportunity to come out from New York City to begin as an intern on the breaking news team at the Oregonian in 2010, which was, I mean, it just feels like a lifetime ago. It was certainly in a different newsroom building. That's when we were still on Broadway. And as I sort of think about this Kyron Horman story and sort of the little piece that I touched during my 10 weeks in Portland 15 years ago, I'm just, reminded of the fact that I think this whole thing kicked off. I'd been in the newsroom for a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks. I think I started right at the end of May. And I was mentioning to Destiny earlier, Julie, before you hopped on, I always remember the date June 4th, because fast forward a few years, June 4th is the day that Kyron Horman disappeared. June 4th, it also happens to be the birthday of my oldest kid. So it's just one of those days you don't forget at this point, at least for me. And this was just, I spent years as a crime and criminal justice reporter. After I finished up journalism school and started my journalism career. And this still remains one of the weirdest, strangest, creepiest, unsettling, and in some ways the most fun story to sort of get to cover, and at least get to cover it sort of collectively as a newsroom.
You said you'd only been on the job for a little over a week. So maybe walk us through the facts of what happened. How did you get put on the story? And then maybe talk a little bit about how the newsroom as a whole rallied to cover this.
Yeah, well, so first of all, our breaking news team at that time was a force to be sort of reckoned with. I think we had, between editors and reporters, maybe 18 or 20 people, maybe even more at that time. I believe in 2010, the Oregonian sort of newsroom staff was over 230 people. And breaking news was, it still continues to be sort of, a real crucial news desk at the paper. But on a major story like this, we could just mobilize a ton of reporters and editors to sort of cover absolutely everything. Now, mind you, I barely had any skills as a journalist at the time, but they still found ways for me to be sort of useful and helpful. So, for instance, I would be one of the reporters that would be out at there was just sort of an endless drumbeat of press conferences and updates. Some of the images that come to mind for me is just, you would have these sheriff's deputies and other search and rescue people that would just be fanning out across broad swaths of either Sauvie Island or Northwest Portland, or they were looking for clues somewhere in Northeast. And there would just be search parties all over the city looking to see if they could find either clues or even Kyron himself, remains of a child if they thought he was deceased. And, often that would be sort of a staging ground for media to ask investigators for sort of updates and just sort of learn kind of the day-to-day, hour-by-hour progress, of this investigation. I mean, this was a national and international sort of news story. It was kind of one of these 24/7 news events that went on for the better part of my entire time that I was in Portland, I was here for 10 weeks in the summer of 2010.
It's crazy that it just coincided. An internship of 10 weeks could look like writing some fun feature pieces and, one crime story. But this was truly like an ongoing sort of situation. And you talk about how you were so fresh to journalism, but they found ways to use you. When did you know that this was like very serious? Was it when you saw that they were dispatching everyone, including interns, or was it because of the days and days and days it went on? Like, when did it click for you that this was not a normal story for an intern to be working on?
Right. Well, if memory serves me correctly, the disappearance of a kid from school, right? Like he was at school and then he was gone. So just under any normal story, just that set of facts alone would be enough to alarm the public sort of in the Portland area. And, quickly a missing kid story can become a national news event, depending on the other sort of details and circumstances. But it wasn't just the fact that we had this kid, and I can still see the turns of phrases within our news copy, the little boy with glasses and the gap tooth grin, just that picture of Kyron alone. That was used in 1,000 news stories, both at the Oregonian and elsewhere. I mean, just the picture of that little boy, I think just really stuck and resonated with people. And then it was just within a few days that the other sort of elements surrounding Kyron's disappearance just took a missing kid story from like a 4 or 5 on the news scale to a 9, 10, and maybe we even turn the dial past 11 once we started learning about Kyron's stepmother, Terry Moulton Horman, the relationship between her and her estranged husband, Kane, Kyron's mother, Desiree. I mean, I'm just recalling all of the names, the people, the circumstances, and it became just a deeply fascinating human interest story, a mystery. I mean, Terry Horman was basically a key person of interest who was in some ways never officially named a suspect in the case, but people just sort of jumped to the conclusion or the assumption that she must have had something to do with her stepchild's disappearance, for better or for worse. And just because the child was never found, his remains were never found, he just completely vanished, that just sort of sustained the interest on and on and on and on, and we just continued to sort of dig into this story, explore all of the different potential angles on a day-to-day, week-by-week basis. And if it would be helpful, I could kind of walk through just some of the other little bits and pieces that I was just assigned to handle just by myself, contributing to some of these larger news stories. I mean, I remember we had like 4 or 5 or 6 people working on this piece at any given time for, day after day, week after week.
Yeah. What were some of those pieces that you personally worked on?
Yeah, well, again, because my journalism skills at that time were fairly remedial. Like I said, I was sort of a body that could go around to press conferences, get good quotes and color, and essentially like phone them into the lead reporter for these stories. That was often Lynn Terry, who was a longtime and excellent journalist at the Oregonian. I know that John Killen and Margaret Haberman, who's still at the paper now, were some of the lead editors, along with Kathleen Glanville. And I would do things such as I I had a whole entire assignment, and this just went on for several days, where I was just trying to find as much information as possible about Terry's previous marriage to a guy named Richard Ecker. So that involved me, for instance, I believe, driving out to Hillsborough one morning and going to the Washington County courthouse and pulling up, because this is sort of 2010 is still on the cusp when you did things when a lot of things were still pretty analog. So, you'd actually go to a courthouse and you'd have to file a records request, handwritten records request to get an entire giant divorce filing, and just sort of start combing through there to find all of these bits and pieces of information about Terry, who was a central character in this story, and her previous marriage to this guy, Richard Ecker. So I just remember, spending literally hours just going through all of these materials and pulling out sort of the relevant or interesting bits and pieces of information. Then after that, I was asked to basically try, maybe not asked, but told to talk to her ex. And when you have a really well-staffed newsroom with a lot of people working on a story, you're afforded to do things that, unfortunately, a lot of news organizations don't have the time and resources to do anymore. So, for instance, I would do hours-long and sometimes day-long stakeouts of a source or subject involved in the story. Terry's ex-husband, Richard, being one of them. So, I can recall literally hours, 4 or 5 hours, just being parked in a parking lot of a strip mall in Beaverton because he worked at a Verizon store out there. And I wasn't going to go barging in there to try to talk to this guy while he was on the clock, but I was essentially going to wait around until he got off of work. And so you just spent the day. I spent the day just hanging out in a parking lot strip mall in Beaverton, waiting for Richard to get off of work. And and that sort of persistence, it's a good reminder too, that persistence can actually pay off in work. So if memory serves me correctly, the first couple of times, because this wasn't just a one and done thing that I would show up at his work, the first few times, the guy was very polite. He was a very nice gentleman, but he had no interest in talking to me whatsoever. Just like, no, thank you. Terry's great. Like, I have nothing to say. Please leave me alone. But, sometimes when somebody says leave you alone, you, as a journalist, are required to, or if your instincts, if you're following your instincts, you just sort of test the limits of that. So I would keep returning to his place of business and hang around for when he got off from work. And then at a certain point in time, as this story continued to progress, as we continued to learn more sort of questionable or interesting things about Terry, Richard's own sort of impression of his ex began to change. And so we got to a point where, he came to sort of expect me waiting for him after work. And then one time he walked straight up to me waiting outside of an Oregonian news car. And he just said, "Okay, what do you want to know?" And then we proceeded to have, a very, very long conversation where he's just, there was nothing sort of earth-shattering or groundbreaking about what he shared, except he was sort of a character witness to, one of the key people in our story who, once she became sort of wrapped up and became sort of a person of interest. She went down to Roseburg where her folks lived and essentially hunkered down there. So we were trying to find any information we could to sort of learn about her and her past. And, this was somebody who was married to her for a number of years. And so just but that was days of work just to sort of have that connection. And, oftentimes these days we aren't afforded that kind of luxury. Even though I would probably say, like, on a major story such as this one at the Oregonian, we'd still certainly be putting in a lot of time and effort and resources. We do that on big stories all the time.
Yeah, and it also gives like a, it is sort of 2010 was really, I would say 2010 to about 2014, 15 was really the cusp of, yeah, a lot of the work that we have to do being analog and like
Right.
it speaks to you're just sitting there analog. You're not asking for somebody for footage of him. You're sitting there and putting in the work. And to your recollection, obviously, the reason why this stays in community consciousness is because people are so troubled by the mystery. Where's the boy? If not the boy, where's the remains? So obviously that's a big question. But was there anything as you were doing this reporting, as you were listening in the newsroom, like any little detail that you held on to that you thought, that's weird. I wish I had the answer to that. Or, something that really like sort of stuck out to you that maybe the public doesn't, really talk about when they gloss over this case.
I think for me, it at first it kind of surprised me, but over time it didn't. That this was just, I mean, it's been 15 years now, so probably a lot of people have just kind of forgotten about it, even in the Portland area. But it just had sort of a persistence for so many years afterward. I mean, this was a story that just haunted hundreds, if not thousands, of people in Portland or around the country. You know, for all of the missing kid stories, most of them get resolved in one way, shape, or form, and this one never did, and it still hasn't. But one thing that just always sort of kept this in my mind. So I left Portland in 2010. I went back to New York where I was living at the time, started my career there, and then I came back to the Pacific Northwest a few years later, and I've been at the Oregonian for good since 2017. But I live like out in the Montevilla neighborhood here in Southeast Portland, and a house in my neighborhood a couple of blocks away, for the first 8 or 9 years that I lived in this house, still in their window had a picture of Kyron Horman. A missing child picture that was just in their window, and it was there day after day, month after month, year after year, for so long. That was just a reminder of just how much this story just sort of stuck with people in a way that not many other stories that I've been a part of have. Although something happened within the last year or two, but relatively recently, that picture was removed from that neighbor's window. They now have, I think they have a sign in their window related to the conflict in Ukraine now. But I was always just sort of blown away, or just reminded all the time of this really remarkable story, on just sort of a really benign, like going on a walk on your block type of basis. But it's certainly one of those stories that sticks with you, and I think it stuck with a lot of people, in part because it was unresolved, in part just because there was something about, without knowing too much about Kyron Horman himself, it was just that image, that just really got seared into people's minds and memories, and evoked all kinds of feelings and emotions around it. And certainly Kane Horman and Desiree Young, I mean, just the pain that they exhibited in such a public way while trying to find their child. I think that just sort of speaks to people in just in a deeply universal kind of way. Now that I'm a parent of, I mean, I have two kids now. One of them's a second grader. They're the age of Kyron when he disappeared. It's just such an unimaginable thing to have happened, and once again to not have that sense of resolution in any kind of meaningful way.
Most of the people we've chatted with for this podcast are parents themselves. I'm a parent myself. And there's something about this case that, even if you didn't have kids at the time when it happened, it sticks in your mind. You send your kid off to school, which is supposed to be this place that's safe. And I think a lot of people think about Kyron. Have you had that experience as a parent yourself?
To your point, Julie, it that's the other sort of key piece to this story, is the fact that a child went missing while they were taken to school. And that just sort of magnifies the discomfort exponentially. I think that alone just sort of uh, just plays into probably sort of every parent's like worst fear or nightmare, and just sort of sets their mind wandering or spinning. So yeah, and just just the sort of the tenderness and gentleness that kind of exuded just from the photos of Kyron himself, but also just the way in which his parents talked about this little boy. Yeah, I mean, they're just sort of universal traits and and attributes of kids. And so yeah, it's hard as a parent not to think about this missing child as you continue to raise a family in Portland.
I don't have kids, but that picture of he's just so cute and so little. You hear 7 years old. Maybe also as parents, you have a better understanding about around 7 year old kids. So I see this picture. He's missing his two little front teeth. He has those tiny little kid glasses. He's just so precious. It's like hard not to think, oh, like what a precious little kid. And it's just like the feeling you feel toward all like adorable, small, precocious children. But I just I can only imagine what a parent might feel in relation to this. However, something a little more, sorry, my eye, something a little more wide reaching is that the current DA, Nathan Vasquez, he ran on the platform that he was going to look into this case again, and he won. And now he says he's going to look into this case again. Former DA Mike Schmidt said he put somebody on this for 4 years while he was there. There were no new developments. What do you think? Where do you think the future of this is? What do you think Vasquez is going to be able to accomplish, if you have any thoughts on that?
I now cover Portland city government and politics, but spent years covering crime and criminal justice issues. And in that line of work, there are just countless examples of breakthroughs in cases, things that were not solved or figured out for decades sometimes. And a lot of that happens because of cold case units within sort of a police department or a district attorney's office, or sort of amateur sleuths that just can't let go of a case that is just a source of endless fascination. So certainly, I mean, every sort of uh, law enforcement body has to sort of weigh the trade-offs, but most try to, if they can afford it, try to keep some funding and resources available to continue to sort of pursue some of these cases that never get solved, just to bring about that sense of closure. And also, I think there is just sort of that inherent draw that we all have, whether you're a cop or or investigator, or just just an interested person in the world. I mean, it's the narrative, it's the story that you want to find the end to. And so I think, in sum, I guess what I would say is that I think it's always a good thing if we can continue sort of putting time and attention toward these unsolved mysteries, because there's always the hope and possibility that we might get the answer to something that we were looking for. And it's hard to imagine this not being just another national and international story, if and when if this case ever does get solved.
Is there anything that we haven't touched on in this conversation? Anything that kind of lingers with you about the case, or just anything else that you'd like to chat about before we wrap up?
No, I think we sort of covered most of the ground here. It's just how profoundly bizarre this story was, and just the surrounding cast of characters, and in particular Terry Horman. Uh, I mean, that is just a singular human being, an individual. I mean, again, We're talking about this 15 years later for a reason. I've covered my fair, an endless cast of bizarre public figures, bizarre, interesting, fascinating public figures. And she's definitely probably in the top 10 still to this day.
Thanks so much for listening to our conversation today. You can find more at OregonLive.com. For the latest on the Kyron Horman case, go to www.OregonLive.com/topic/Kyron-Horman. Join us next time for another episode of Beat Check.
If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is a subscription to the Oregonian /Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.